Hello and welcome to the discussion Environmental and Human Rights, and thank you for also choosing this discussion. We have very interesting guests that I would like to introduce to you now. So I'm sitting here at the BMW World with three internal BMW experts, and I would like to start with Patrick Hudde. He is head of raw material management. Then we also have Claudia Becker, senior expert supply chain management, and Mike Böres, head of sustainability and mobility. Hello to the three of you. And then we also have three external experts which are with us today digitally, so around the globe. And I start with Alyssa Newman. She's responsible supply chain program manager at Google. Hi, Alyssa.
Hello.
We have Leah Butler, executive director, responsible business alliance.
Hello.
And Rebecca Burton, director communication and corporate engagement, IRMA. Hi, Rebecca.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you so much for joining. But before we start, I would like to tell the participants that you always have the opportunity to ask your questions. You can use the chat window and then just drop your questions. And afterwards, we will have some time to address your questions. And at this point, I want to introduce you to my colleague, Melanie, who will be reading all your questions during the time. Please say hi to Melanie. In a few seconds, you will also see Melanie. She's not a robot, she's actually a person. Hi, Melanie. Thanks for doing this great job. Thank you very much, and see you later. Perfect. So let's start again with the survey that we did, and we start with the question that was, how important is a sustainable supply chain to you personally when buying a product? And let's see what our participant answered. So they said it's very important, and this is very dominant here. We have 56% saying that it's very, very important. Thank you very much for participating in this question. And now I would like to hand over to Rebecca. How important is a sustainable supply chain to you personally when buying a product?
On a personal level, incredibly important, actually. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I think I'm just really excited to look into this conversation of the intersection between human rights and environmental rights, because again, on a personal level, I'm really looking at both of them at the same time, given their intersectionality and the fact that they really go hand in hand, which I'll look very much forward to speaking to later.
Great, thank you so much. Leah, what does sustainable supply chain mean to you?
It's a good question. I think sustainable supply chain has very much a temporal aspect, in that we know sustainability is about long-term positive impacts for people and planet. And so one of the key things with sustainability is, how do we take care of future generations while we work to understand really what's going on currently when it comes to environmental impacts, human rights impacts today, to help to mitigate those issues going forward.
Yeah, I totally agree. Alyssa, what was your expectation how people answered to this question? Or did this answer surprise you, or were you quite familiar that all those results will come up?
It's not surprising to me. I think that, there certainly is a lot more awareness of the intersection of what a sustainable brand should be, and the importance that people place on it. I think we're at a time in the world that there's a lot more communication on exactly how we're connected, and the importance of preserving resources, and that people are willing to put a premium on that.
Yes, definitely. So this was quite dramatic. I think it was 56% saying that it's very important to them. Thank you for commenting on those results. Patrick, what are the BMW Group goals with regards to environmental and social standards in the supply chain?
So our goal is clearly to be a leader in this field. So we aim to have the most sustainable supply chain in the worldwide automotive industry. And this is a topic we've been engaged in for years. So we have the highest standards in our own business, in our own production, and we expect our suppliers to follow the same standards as well. And we expect our suppliers to ensure that their supply chain is sustainable as well. And sustainability is an integral part of our tendering process. We have in our tender documents, we have many requirements, even set out in our international purchasing terms and conditions, requirements for our suppliers that they need to fulfill in order to receive a nomination from BMW to supply products to BMW. And in the nomination process, we don't only look at cost or quality, we look at sustainability as well. So if the requirements that we set out are not fulfilled, this can really be a showstopper. It will stop a nomination for a supplier. And this is not something that we've been doing only for the last couple of months. It's something we've started it in 2008 with the i3, and we've rolled it out for all of our products in 2014. And we are working on this continually improving these requirements. And we also follow through on this on an operational level. So we have complaints mechanisms in place with which we ensure that we can detect problems in the field, and we have a supply chain response team, for example, that ensures that we react to complaints from the field within 48 hours. And beyond that, we're trying to go way beyond that. So we are involved in many initiatives. For example, IRMA, where we try to promote the development of sustainable supply chains and to promote standards with regards to sustainability in the supply chain. And again, this is only the current status, and we are moving towards further development of all of these standards, and our goal is clearly to be the leader in this field.
Wow, what a great goal. Claudia, where do you see the biggest hurdles to become such a leader and also for implementing strategy?
Thank you for the question. Well, I can just continue where Patrick basically has stopped his presentation, and by saying like we have set the highest social and environmental standards to ourselves. How can we assure that also our suppliers and their sub-suppliers meet those standards? And that's, I think, also a question to our external experts, where we are looking for inputs on this tricky question. Because if we're looking at a vehicle, I mean, raw materials, of course, are the basis for every part that's produced. But our main business is we're purchasing parts. So our 12,000 suppliers that we're having achieve roughly 70% of our value creation. So how can we assure with these supply chains? And in the last weeks we have been speaking in webinars, is it really a supply chain? Shouldn't we call it a supplier network or a supplier web? Because it's so many partners therein. So really following the way from raw materials, from the mine to the vehicle, is really such a complex and difficult issue. So really, the biggest hurdle I would say is really that our supply chains are multi-layered. So they really range from, well, an average 5 to 8 tier levels. And then they are, of course, global. So they are spanning different geographies, some with weak rules of law, for example, where it's more difficult to enforce human rights and environmental protection. And then, of course, they are dynamic. So if we're looking at a supply chain today, they might be different tomorrow because of the availability and prices of raw materials that are traded on metal exchanges and stocks. So if we're looking at the solutions we're conducting at the BMW Group, I think we have heard some of them already also in the discussion in the beginning of today's session with Ralf Hattler, for example. So we have a criticality assessment where we just evaluate which raw materials are we using and what's the association with sustainability risks for each of these raw materials. So the more critical those issues, of course, the more attention we also pay to those raw materials. So as Ralf was mentioning, for cobalt, we decided to purchase the raw material directly. But we also went one step further and we started a crown project in the DR Congo where we try to really professionalize artisanal mining together with partners from our supply chain. And then, of course, also the initiatives that were already mentioned. So, for example, for aluminium and steel, the two raw materials that we are most using for producing vehicles, we joined specific raw material initiatives, the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative and Responsible Steel. So really discussing with upstream, downstream, and also civil society what the sustainability standard for that specific raw material shall look like. And then with IRMA, of course, addressing the reality that we're not just using 2, but more than 30 raw materials, and trying with this initiative to really leverage environmental and social standards in those chains as well.
Having heard now more about the strategy, but also about the hurdles, I would like to jump into the discussion and ask our external partners how they would rate the goals and measures of the BMW Group. Alyssa, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I would say, I guess maybe for full disclosure, we do work with BMW, so I might have a bias. We'll share that. I actually met Claudia when she was in Berkeley, doing some collaborative work related to cobalt. I would say BMW is doing great work. Certainly, the Cobalt Initiative in the DRC is an excellent example. But I think something that Claudia spoke to is a supplier network, and I'd say it not only is BMW leading, but it takes leaders to step in and collaborate and get involved in the field, not just within their own brand. I think that's a sign of a good leader, is that you're not just doing it yourself, but you're working in collaboration with partners in areas, even as Claudia mentioned, artisanal mining that might not be in your direct supply chain, but you want to work on issues on the ground and get involved specifically. And I would say that's probably the best sign of leader. It's not just related to your project. It's about a broader narrative of how we're working to address these issues globally and work together to solve them.
Thank you, Alyssa. Rebecca, how would you rate the goals and measures?
I would say that I see BMW as such a leader, and actually, so the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, has been referred to a couple of times now. And I just want to give you a bit of background on what we actually seek to achieve so that you understand, so that everyone who's listening understands the high bar level that we're putting forward, and thus the high bar that BMW is requesting its suppliers, specifically its mining suppliers, to meet. So the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance is a comprehensive standard. And the idea is that it covers the whole range of impacts that you might think about when you think about a mine's performance. So social responsibility, environmental responsibility, governance, and closure. And there are a whole list of requirements. And those requirements were developed through collaboration. Just like Alyssa spoke to just now, collaboration is so important. And so those requirements were developed by a collaborative effort of 5 different stakeholder groups that came together around the table: mining companies, labor unions, nonprofits or NGOs, mining affected communities, and purchasers of mine materials similar to BMW. So those 5 stakeholder groups came around the table and said, if mining is to be responsible, what should it look like? And they, over 10 years of working together, developed a standard for responsible mining. And so now, IRMA, we actually go into the mine site and use that standard through a third-party assurance to measure a mine's performance. And so when we talk about rigor and we talk about high bar standards, and when BMW talks about expecting the same standards of their suppliers as they hold for themselves, this is what they're referring to. It's the most robust and high bar definition of what responsible mining is. And so I would just point actually to BMW's leadership in this area, because previously we had tech and jewelry as members of IRMA, and BMW was the first automaker to come in. And by making a very clear ask of their mining suppliers to engage in IRMA, I can say that we've definitely been hearing from more and more mining companies. We've always known that IRMA will be driven by the market, by purchasers of mine materials asking for mines to be assessed against IRMA. And now BMW is coming in and making that clear ask. And I can tell you it's really making a difference and increasing the uptake of IRMA in the industry.
Wow, what a huge compliment. Leah, what is your opinion on that?
Well, not to repeat what other fellow panelists have said, but maybe some other areas to highlight is some of the themes that have come out so far. Complexity in the supply chain, the number of parts and suppliers, the relationship building with suppliers over time, and the role of partnership. So those are all quite crucial, and we see BMW playing across all of those to not just drive down standards in their supply chain, whether that be the IRMA standard, as Rebecca has discussed, the Responsible Business Alliance's BAP program or RMI standards, but actually leapfrogging that as well and saying it's not just about adherence to standards, it's building capacities and working on root cause issues so that those suppliers can actually meet those expectations. And I think through BMW's longer term commitments as well on supplier outreach, capacity building, and then the projects in mining communities help deliver that. And that's gets to the sustainability point earlier. As we know, this transformation of supply chains and supplier networks does take time. And so just another comment on the leadership ability is to follow through on those commitments and whatever the time and resources needs to get there, working with partners, other industries outside of automotive. And that's where BMW, I think, is really shining a light as well, working with the electronics sector, retail, around joint standards, joint assessment programs to really reach that broader impact. So that's another area we've seen BMW kind of being a forerunner when it comes to cross-industry collaboration.
Thank you very much. Were you aware that those experts actually say that BMW is already doing a great job and is actually a role model? Claudia, you're smiling.
Well, I'm smiling because I know our experts fairly well. With some of them, we're basically having communications on a daily basis. And on the other hand, yes, I mean, it's a tough job also. And yeah, it starts and then you need to also follow actions in order to have an impact. And that's, daily business. And I think we had a good start, but it's tough work also for the next years.
Yeah, making an impact that was taken very seriously. Mike, public pressure on supply chain issues is actually increasing. Why do you have to force companies to adhere environmental and social standards in their supply chain? And why doesn't the BMW Group do not this voluntarily?
So that's a good question, but as we have discussed and as my colleagues and also the colleagues online have mentioned, so BMW has started early in the supply chain in implementing environmental and social standards. So nobody has to force us. We as a premium company, for us, it is clear we have, let's say, the responsibility. We are in the driver's seat. We can make that recommendations to our supplier network. If we will not do it, so nobody will do it. And I'm very happy that all the experts online really appreciate what we are doing. I'm not as long in that job already, but seeing with that what have been done so far and that in the stakeholder community and the expert, it turns out to be a good job. That makes me very happy. Yes, the world outside is difficult. It's becoming more and more difficult because everybody is looking on manufacturers like BMW. With electrification, we have totally new raw materials in our products. As Thomas Becker has said earlier, the part of the supply chain, the materials we implement in the vehicles in an electric vehicle makes 80% of the CO2 emissions. And it's clear for us that we have to dive into it. And I think we are 95% on target. But what is discussed outside is maybe the 5% which is still missing, and that we are working on. We are committed to do so, and the colleagues here have a tough job, but we see we are on a good line to achieve those standards.
Yeah. You just said the 5%, that is what the people are discussing about. To our external experts, is that what you generally observe, that it's only the 5%, or are there other brands that are not doing such a great job? Rebecca.
Go ahead. I saw Alyssa speaking as well. I wonder if I can answer this question a bit differently, if that's okay.
For sure.
And sort of channel my colleague who's speaking on the CO2 panel right now, Amy Boulanger, who's the executive director. And I think what I would actually emphasize here is the importance that while we focus on CO2, we don't do it to the detriment of actually focusing on other impacts that may actually be much more important at the mine site. So even though when we think of, the mine site emissions being the most emissions when it comes to an electric vehicle, that may be true, but I think that we need to think more about the impacts at the mine site, and that's really where the gravest risks are to the environment and to human rights outside of CO2 emissions. And what I mean by outside of that, it could be dewatering of a community's water resources, or making a community's water resources dirty and unusable, for example. It could be destruction of indigenous sites or sacred lands. And it could, there are so many other risks that can happen at the mine site beyond CO2 production alone, that I think it's important when we talk about that point in the supply chain specifically, that we think about the range of risks that are there beyond emissions only.
Thank you. Alyssa, is there anything you wanted to also to say? I wasn't
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, as I have a picture of an iceberg, a friend of mine, Camille Seaman, is a big ice photographer. Certainly climate change is incredibly pressing. And as Rebecca mentioned, I have been on other panels where we want to talk about the importance of decarbonization, accelerating renewable energy. Yes, that's very important. And heard BMW talk about the importance for their supply chain. But we can't ignore the human rights issues at the front end of supply chain, and the fact that we're inextricably linked. And if you're harming communities at the beginning of your supply chain with an acceleration or a focus on EV and renewable energy, that we're just going to be repeating the same pattern and exacerbating the issue. So I think that's where it's, I think as my fellow panelists and BMW team has talked about, we need to collaborate. We need to work on intersecting issues. We need to look at the whole picture. Maybe not just that one iceberg, but we need to look at the planet and how we're connected and work on issues simultaneously. That's where we're really going to make a difference.
Yes. Is there anything anyone would like to add? Please, Patrick.
Maybe just to kind of round that up too, it's the how. It's the how we implement, not just what we're actually doing. A good example is BMW's work around cobalt and child labor issues, knowing that to reduce child labor in mine sites, it also needs to be accompanied with discussions around livelihoods and addressing social economic conditions within those producing countries. So it's linked, and I think collaboration on how we get to those positive impacts is an important part of this.
Thank you, Leah. Patrick also wanted to say something.
Yeah, you mentioned that while we focus on CO2, we shouldn't forget the environmental and social aspects. Do you see any areas where bringing both into balance is a special challenge?
Bringing into balance the human rights and
both
environment.
CO2, fulfilling CO2 targets and fulfilling environmental and social standards. Do you see any specific areas, for example, in raw materials, where you see a challenge in achieving both goals at the same time?
No, I don't think that there's necessarily a challenge in achieving both goals at the same time. I think what we're raising a flag about is just ensuring that the focus doesn't become too narrow in terms of emissions only. But I certainly think both can be achieved at the same time.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I would like to continue with another question that we also had in our survey and share the result with you. So the question of the survey the question in the survey was evaluating car manufacturers on a scale from 1 to 5 for the most sustainable supply chain. I would rate the BMW Group as, and then we have very poor, poor, fair, good, or excellent. And we can already see the results. It's very dominantly in the middle. 59% say that it's fair, but also we have people saying 26% saying good and 10% saying excellent. Alyssa, are these results surprising you?
I think scales are hard. It's surprising and not surprising. I think maybe we're at a moment in time where we're more critical and maybe are looking for more leadership. So I would say it's a little surprising to me, but also not surprising, and perhaps it's just a challenge to look for other areas to improve. I don't know. I'm curious what other panelists and maybe even how it landed with the BMW team.
Yes, I actually wanted to hand over now to Mike. What do you say to these results?
Knowing what we do so far then it's not surprising me that much. But what is surprising me in that field is that as well the outdoor world sees us in the same way as we are moving the projects forward. So that makes me very happy that the work of the teams here internally and of our company is communicated and outside, and the people are aware of it. That makes me happy.
That's great. What about the two of you?
Well, I would actually hope that if we ask this question the next time, that it moves from fair to good.
Yeah.
Just by looking at the really huge landscape of raw materials we're already addressing. Cobalt, we do have definitely the most diverse program, really ranging from on-the-ground projects in the DRC over direct sourcing. But we were also the first company to publish our smelters and refiners and countries of origin on our website. We have the same transparency level for lithium. We're joining so many initiatives, and it's not just aluminium, steel. We were also founding member of this global platform on what's it called, sustainable natural rubber, where we also want to set the standard here in this raw material supply chain. And then, of course, 3TGs, although we're not yet the legislation on 3Ts that's available in the US and England is not yet touching us. We're working with the Responsible Mineral Initiative since years and are asking our supply chain where those raw materials are coming from. And also for cobalt, I'm working there on many working groups to address really, or to work towards more standards here. As Leah was saying, this standard that's currently in discussion for artisanal mining will first to be deployed for cobalt, but then could be rolled out to further raw materials, such as mica that is produced artisanally as well. So there's really such a huge bandwidth of topics, and I think we just have to communicate them further. To show that we're not just starting, but already since years, since the i3 was produced, where we had really a vast product portfolio from leather that was tanned with olive leaves, or Kenaf, a fiber plant that was produced in Bangladesh, where we also had an on-the-ground project. So it's really a huge experience that we are looking upon already.
Claudia just said it, that it's mostly the communication. From your perspective, why do people not associate the BMW brand with a sustainable supply chain?
That's a good question. I wonder if it's because maybe sustainability is not that much associated yet with the automobile. So my expectation, my hope would be that if when sustainability becomes more and more important for customers, who buy cars, that they will look more closely into the manufacturers whom they buy those cars from, and that then they will start looking for all of these things that we are doing. And then when they do start asking these questions, they will discover that the BMW Group is actually already today a leader in this field. So it is, I think, communicating it to the outside is one thing, and it's very important. And obviously that's part of what we're doing today. But my hope is, again, that people will start asking more questions of their, the companies whom they buy their cars from.
Asking question is a great word, because now we have the time to actually see if we have received any questions from the audience. And I ask my colleague Melanie if we received questions so far. I hope there are some. Now she's coming over here. Hello. Thank you very much, Melanie. An applause for you. It's always very difficult to give a digital applause. So, we received the following question. Child labor is forbidden everywhere. Shouldn't it be a job for the local governments to solve this problem? Is there anyone who wants to answer to that question? I repeat it again.
I could start off on that.
Yeah, Leah, please go ahead.
Happy to. I mean, it's a complex issue, of course, and as I sort of stated earlier, it's an all hands on deck, meaning it's not either or. Governments, civil society, NGOs, companies. It really does take the power of the market. And Rebecca alluded to this earlier in reference to the adoption of standards, but actually the power of the market to drive responsible sourcing practices, to support producers, ASM operators, large-scale mining operations that do adhere to those standards, and then governments as well, both provincial, national governments, to have enforcement mechanisms in place, oversight mechanisms that are effective and can see the responsible identification and mitigation of child labor concerns in and around ASM sites, especially with child labor being very much related to conditions of poverty, that those linkages to education systems and livelihoods have to be acknowledged. So that is where the sort of public-private partnerships come in, and industry working in consortiums like the Responsible Business Alliance and the Responsible Minerals Initiative to help address those kinds of root cause issues, and then using tools like standards, capacity building, child protection programs in place in those communities, really to see that systemic change and long-term transition. But it's a very acute issue, certainly with particular commodities in particular areas, and it's a key focus in some of the standards that were as well discussed today.
Thank you, Leah. Anyone would like to add something?
Yeah,
yes,
maybe.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. I think what Leah said is really crucial, and so it's not one governmental body who could solve the problem. It's not one initiative. So it's the work of the whole supply chain, of everybody who is involved. And what Patrick said before, we have a team which follows up issues 48 hours after they come into our mind. So we are not happy to get those issues, but we are prepared really to go out if we find something which is not in our not in the way we meant to be it, not in our contracts. If there is something in material lives, then we activate the team and try to solve the problem. So everybody is responsible for that in the whole supply chain.
Yes, definitely. So we received one more question. Claudia, that one is for you. Please, some more information about the BMW project in DRC. Isn't this a typical greenwashing project?
Yeah. Well, good question, of course. And well, also to answer the first question, I mean, we initiated this project in order to address the root causes of child labor. So when we look at the raw materials we're using for the vehicle, cobalt is definitely the one that's associated most strongly with the risk of child labor. But well, we need to make the differentiation. It's not in the large-scale mining, it's in the artisanal sector in the DRC. And before we started this project, we actually had a study together with the University of Berkeley where we analyzed the extent of child labor in the DRC. And this study then, well, showed, of course, there is a lot of child labor and it's in mining. The numbers were deviating a little bit from those studies by Amnesty International, but still it was for us the reason to say, like, we want to get involved there, although we're in a first step not sourcing from the DRC. So we were really saying, like, let's have a look at this artisanal mining and can we do it in a sustainable, in a responsible way. So really piloting at a concrete mine site, can we introduce working standards that are high enough that they would fulfill our own requirements towards sustainability. So therefore, I would definitely say it's not a greenwashing project because we want to address this artisanal mining to see if we can bring it up to a level that it would qualify for our own supply chains. And if this is the case, then we would purchase also this material and integrate it into our next generation of batteries. And this all is accompanied, of course, by also community component in order to address the root cause of child labor, because kids are not working because they like it. It's mostly poverty driven, so the parents don't have, for example, enough money to pay those little school fees that apply, or just to feed the whole family. So we therefore also have community components here that, well, on the first hand, eliminate all school fees, for example, that also engage women to generate more income, also financial literacy trainings in order to manage the household income better, and also saving groups, further components as well. So in order to really strengthen the community, to keep the kids at school, at home, and then also to make artisanal mining safer, to find out if it can be a sourcing alternative for us.
Yeah, totally. Patrick, there was also a question for you. How much cheaper are cobalt and lithium from non-sustainable sources for companies like BMW?
So for cobalt, that's a very simple question. There's a market price, so there's no difference. For lithium, that's a more difficult question because there is not a market like cobalt, not a market price set yet. But with regards to unsustainable lithium being less expensive than sustainable lithium, there's not necessarily a connection there. You have to look at the entire value chain, and lithium comes from different parts of the world in different types of mining. So that's you can't really compare that. But I wouldn't say that it's generally a correct statement to say unsustainable raw materials are cheaper or the cheaper option than sustainable raw materials.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you to our participants for those questions. Coming back to the second video that we've seen as an introduction to this discussion round, people were saying that the BMW brand is not the first one they associate with a sustainable supply chain. And we've also heard it here in the discussion, it's needed to have more communication, that more questions are asked to our external experts. Which recommendations and expectations do you have for the BMW Group? Leah, would you like to start?
Sure. This might come into something Patrick said earlier, which is the perception around how does automotive fit into the the image of sustainability. And I think we can see, looking at past regulation and focus has been on other industries, but this is also a recognition that electronics, for example, which has been part of regulations in the US, for example, cars have many electronic components, and there's all this interconnectivity. So I do think, going forward, seeing the bridge between and the connections between what other industries are doing, the partnerships and the innovative programs they've put together, the leadership position and new ways of thinking as well within the automotive sector can help drive further change. But it's that kind of cross-industry collaboration, I think, is where we see a really ripe for continued investment for just seeing positive impact over time. I also do think that we work very closely with BMW as part of the RBA and RMI, and see the inner workings, but it's how to communicate that so that it's understandable by customers, by consumers, and also by consumer-facing brands. And that's an area I think where many companies are struggling with. And so we're looking forward to working with BMW on disclosure, transparency, communications, as we work to really rise up all of industry.
Talking to my BMW experts, would you like to comment on that? Anything you would like to add to this? Okay, otherwise I would hand over to Rebecca. Which recommendations do you have?
I would agree with Leah in terms of the complexity of this messaging, and I think Claudia has touched on it as well. The idea that there are so many components in the car and there are so many different issues to work on. So she's touched on leather, rubber, and then all of the minerals that we've talked about as well. Literally dozens of minerals. And each of those components receive a different level of sort of awareness in the press, right, in terms of whether or not there are issues. And then it's a question of how do you communicate on them. So I think going back about 10 minutes of where we were surprised in terms of how the audience rated, right, fair, good, excellent. I'm not sure I was surprised, only because I think there are so many issues that the company is seeking to address. And while there is so much transparency on the work that they're doing, I think any company who really wants to make a positive and real change is also very careful before they actually speak to an initiative that they're working on. So just to say, there's a complexity of issues that are being worked on. They're all at different stages. So at what point do you actually communicate about them, right? That's something to navigate. And so I think in terms of navigating all of those, it's being responsive to what people are worried about right now. So lithium and cobalt, we've already touched on, is very clear. And continuing to do the work on other materials where issues may arise in the future that we're not even aware of. So I think just the fact that they're looking at every element of the supply chain is really important. And I think the time for those communications will come.
Thank you very much. Alyssa, which expectations, but also which recommendations do you have?
I would say, building off of what Leah shared, and even one of the questions from a participant that was listening, and I think as Rebecca touched on as well, there's storytelling, that there's marketing, there's greenwashing, and I think companies have to be very careful of how they communicate the issues like child labor. Modern slavery hasn't been mentioned yet, but modern slavery is unfortunately alive and well. And I think, as our fellow participants have shared as well, it's I think when you're confronted with issues on the ground, and there's a question of what do you know is in your supply chain, and how are you working with initiatives like the RBA, Responsible Minerals Initiative, to ensure compliance across multiple companies. I think it comes back to storytelling, and then having the right story at the right time. And certainly we produced a VR film called Journey of Gold, and with the intention of being able to take people to a mine site and address that. But I think there's more that we can do, and it's actually is an area that we hope to work more collaboratively with our fellow RMI members, maybe even IRMA. We haven't had a lot of conversation with IRMA yet. But I think BMW needs to be cautious of how you say anything is mission solved. But we can do more storytelling and bring consumers in, because that's how we ensure accountability across multiple supply chains. And I think it was Claudia that talked about our supply chain as an ecosystem. If we really approach this more as we're in this together, as we only have one planet, we share resources, then we can bring users into stories in a way that helps them be informed users across multiple products that they'll be interacting with in their lives.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And I think it's a great task to actually do storytelling, tell people more about what you're actually doing, what the word is concerning about. I would like to thank you very, very much, the three external experts, but also to the three internal experts. Thank you so much for giving all the insights. I'm sure that everyone listening to the past 45 minutes learned a lot about the topic. And I would like to say to the audience, please stay tuned, because in a few minutes we will also have another interview. And I would like to hand over to my colleague Martin, who's already at the main stage together with board member Dr. Andreas Wendt. And then we see each other in a few minutes. Stay tuned.